Welcome to the Master of Disaster series. In this one, we'll teach you how to install Zerto Virtual Replication, otherwise known as ZVR. Here's the agenda. First, we'll go through some definitions, then we'll look at the architecture, the requirements, and then we'll get to the installation. So let's look at the components that it takes to install Zerto Virtual Replication. First is the Zerto Virtual Manager. The Zerto Virtual Manager is a Windows service. It installs very much like vCenter itself, but it manages everything required for the replication between your different sites, protected and recovery sites. It completely integrates with vCenter Server, and it gives you an inventory of the disks, the VMs, the networks, etc. And then it allows for Zerto management functionality to coordinate along with vCenter. It monitors changes in the VMware environment, and it responds accordingly to what Zerto needs to support it. For example, a vMotion from one host to another allows Zerto Virtual Replication to understand that that's happened by using the Zerto Virtual Manager. Next is the Zerto Virtual Replication Appliance. This is simply a virtual machine deployed by the ZVM, and it's an OVF file. It's installed on each ESX host because it actually performs the replication between the protected and the recovery sites. It manages the replication of data from the protected site to the recovery site. And the interface to all this is via the Zerto vSphere Client Console plugin. Effectively, it creates a tab in vSphere Client to where you can manage your replication and recovery DR environment. So let's look at the architecture. As we see, we have a pretty standard VMware infrastructure. We've got vCenter servers at both sites. We've got hosts at each site. What we'll do is we're going to install the Zerto Virtual Manager to communicate with vCenter Server, and then we're going to install the virtual replication appliances on each host at Site 1. So we'll put one on the left one and the right one here. And then at Site 2, it's the same thing. It's a vCenter Server at Site 2. We'll install the Zerto Virtual Manager, and then we'll install the VRA at Site 2 as well. After that, we'll pair the sites. Then our infrastructure is complete. Now let's look at the requirements. As we saw in the architecture, we need one vCenter at each site. We need a Windows server at each site for the ZVM installation. We need at least one ESX host at each site. And we'll also need to have network connectivity, the open ports in your firewall. And you can find all that information out if you refer to the Zerto Replication Installation and Getting Started guide. It's important to note that even though we say one Windows server is required for the ZVM installation, in a test environment you can actually install it on the vCenter server, but only in test. Now it's time to install ZVR. Be sure that you do all the installations from the ZVM machine at each site. So we're going to start on Site 1. We've downloaded the data from Zerto's website, and we hit the run on the installer. And as you'll see, it's just a normal MSI installer. It will open up the step through wizard, and we'll hit next on that first step. Then we'll accept the license agreement. Feel free to read the whole thing if you'd like, but they all pretty much say the same thing, yes or no. And then we'll use the default location for the install. It doesn't take up much room, and it doesn't really grow. Now this step is looking at the Zerto Virtual Manager IP address, making sure that the ports are open between the vSphere and ZVM and also the VRAs in the ZVM. The next information is really changeable after the fact. It's just saying what the site name is, the location, the contact information of the person at that particular site. Then we'll hit next. This is how the ZVM actually talks to vCenter Server. So we're going to plug in the IP address of the vCenter Server. And then we'll put in credentials to be able to be having the ZVM talk to the vCenter Server. It needs to be an administrator. Then we hit next. On this step, we're not going to be integrating with vCloud Director, but if we were, we would fill out these fields. Now the wizard does some connectivity checks and performs other functionality necessary for the installation. Everything checks out, so now we're ready to hit Next. And it does a summary, then we hit Next once again, and the installation actually starts happening. The install successfully completes, and then we hit Finish. Now I'd like to do a couple of confirmation tasks. I just want to open up the services and go down and check and make sure the Zerto service is started automatically. It should be by default, but you never know sometimes with different Windows servers. It's always good to check. And it's up and alive. That's good. Now we want to install the Zerto license and our first VRA. To do that, we log into the vCenter at the first site. It's important to note if you had the vSphere client open during the Zerto install, close it and open it back up. And what you should see is the Zerto tab when you log in for the first time. If it's not there, just enable it in the vSphere client plugins. Now the first thing you will see is where you enter in the Zerto license. So grab that file, copy it, and then paste in a valid license, hit update, and it'll take it a couple seconds. Then what you'll see is the summary view of Zerto. In order to zoom up the Zerto view, I need to borrow some room from the vSphere client, so I'm going to take away some of the menus and things that aren't necessary for this view. And I'm also going to pull the inventory slider over to really give us as much view as we can to the Zerto tool. Now, it's important to note that on your settings, when you're setting it up, you're going to have plenty of screen space. I just had to zoom this up a lot in order for me to share this to you. So I want to add a VRA, and I hit Install VRA, and I just add in the host that I want to add it to, the password of the host, because I'm going to open firewall ports and some functionality there, and then pick the data store that I want the VRA installed to, the network, the amount of RAM by default is good. On larger deployments you can actually increase that. Then I'll put in a dedicated IP address for that VRA and the default gateway, and then I will click install once I have the address in there. If you recall from the definitions slide, we did talk about that the VRA is deployed from an OVF file. I'm going to pull up the task view here. That way you can watch the integration that Zerto has with vCenter itself. Every task that we perform is shown in the vCenter task because we are integrated into not only the vSphere client, but also tightly integrated with vCenter itself. Now it's successfully installed, and we can move that down and hit close. And the next thing we'll see is once we hit close is the summary screen now has a green checkbox showing VRAs are installed. Site 1 is done, so now let's install ZVR on Site 2. Now, I'm not going to have you go through the slow way of doing it, even though it was very fast on Site 1. But this will provide you a summary of what happened on our install on Site 1. We do the exact same thing on Site 2, and notice it goes much faster when you speed it up through the magic of video editing. Now Site 2 is installed in 30 seconds, basically. Now we'll log into the vCenter at Site 2. Notice we weren't logged in once again while we did the installation. That way the plugin should come in successfully. But if not, remember you just add the plugins in through the vSphere Client's Plugins menu. Great, I see a Zerto tab, so that means it was successfully added. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to that Zerto tab, and this time instead of adding in a license key, we're actually going to do two things at once. We're going to pair Site 2 to Site 1 by using its IP address, and it will verify that the license is good, and it will pair the sites at the same time. This is a great example of how Zerto approaches all workflows. If we can accomplish two things at once, we'll certainly do that. So now the site pairing and license confirmation is just about done, and then we pop up a screen that looks very familiar if we did Site 1. I've borrowed the same space from the vSphere client, and now I can just hit Manage VRAs, and we'll install the VRA. The installation is just like on Site 1. We select Install New VRA. We add in the IP address information, the network information, the root password of the host, and then we hit Install, and we deploy our VRA at site number 2. And remember, that's an OVF file coming from the ZVM. Now I'm only showing you how to install one VRA. You would repeat this for every host in the cluster per site that you want to be in the cluster doing replication. So now our VRA is complete, and we should see a screen that looks pretty familiar to us at this point. It's the summary screen, and now we're installed. So to summarize, we looked at the different definitions of the components necessary for a Zerto installation. We looked at the architecture, the requirements, and we actually did the installation of Site 1 and Site 2. We have the sites connected and paired, and we're ready to move on to further podcast in the Master of Disaster series, where we actually protect VMs, we do failovers and failbacks, and we look at advanced functionality of Zerto. Thank you for watching this Master of Disaster podcast, and hopefully you have a much better idea on how to install ZVR.